Washington is reeling from what insiders are calling an unprecedented political implosion. A high-stakes shutdown strategy intended to weaken the president instead triggered a Democratic mutiny, left the leadership humiliated, and paved the way for a populist victory that redefined economic relief. How did a short-term legislative battle turn into a political obituary for one of the Capitol's most powerful figures? Stay with us as we break this down in our in-depth discussion right here on News Focus Podcast. And if you find our reporting valuable, please hit the like button and subscribe to support our channel. We truly appreciate it. The drama coming out of Washington this week, especially around this whole federal shutdown debacle, is being described as a political suicide attempt.
Yeah, executed by the very people who started it. We're looking at sources that track political momentum, internal party dynamics, and the contrast between, the lead up and the collapse is it's staggering.
It really is. It's the textbook definition of hubris.
Hubris leading to disaster. Absolutely. So let's unpack that initial context. Just 48 hours before the entire strategy just turned into chaos, Democrats were reportedly basking in this glow of momentum.
Right. They'd just had some recent local election wins.
Exactly. And they were bragging openly. They believed they had these, political tailwinds going into this big legislative fight.
And that atmosphere of confidence, that's so crucial because it completely informed the calculation that was made by the Senate leadership. The analysis we're seeing suggests the Senate Minority Leader, Chuck Schumer, he thought he could safely play chicken with the president over funding the government.
Right. And this was seen, according to insiders, as this necessary fight. He had to prove his strength. He had to secure legislative concessions. This was the moment.
This wasn't just some boring budgetary standoff.
No, not at all. It was designed to be high stakes, maximum leverage. The explicit goal, as it was articulated in the briefings we've reviewed, was to showcase the president's supposed inflexibility.
His inability to govern.
Right, to force him to cave to their demands or, shoulder all the blame for the government grinding to a halt. It was a calculated risk.
And if it had worked?
If it had worked, it would have given the party huge momentum going into the next election cycle.
But it didn't. The immediate result wasn't political leverage. It was just total chaos for his side. This strategy collapsed almost instantly. It left the entire Democratic Party humiliated and, so the key part, completely empty-handed. They walked away with no funding concessions, no leverage, no wins at all.
And the tactical failure here was, it was multi-layered, but fundamentally it came down to a profound misreading of the political moment.
And the opponent.
The analysis we're seeing strongly asserts that this shutdown, which was specifically engineered to weaken the president, ended up strengthening him, way beyond anything the Beltway could have anticipated.
So how does that happen? How does a government shut down something that's inherently unpopular with the public, end up boosting the president's standing?
Well, it really just comes down to narrative control and perceived culpability. So while one side was engaged in what the public saw as, petty brinkmanship.
Demanding policy writers, all this internal squabbling.
Exactly. The president focused his messaging entirely on one idea: keeping the government open for the American people. Devoid of all these extra policy demands, he effectively managed to control the budget narrative completely.
So he comes out of this, according to these sources, looking like the only adult in the room.
That's the phrase.
He maintained control over the resolution, the optics, even while the government did briefly shut down.
Precisely. The initial goal of crippling him politically not only failed, but the crisis handed him this perfect platform to appear reasonable, focused on, fundamental government responsibility.
The public tends to blame the party that makes the big, risky move.
And when that move fails to achieve anything, the political cost is immense. The shutdown backfired, and it gave the president a public mandate to just proceed with his agenda, completely unfettered by the demands the Democrats had hoped to extract.
And the evidence that this was a complete catastrophe isn't just, internal whispers. It's being screamed from the rooftops by some of the most prominent Democrats out there.
Oh, yeah. The postmortem was swift and it was brutal, particularly among these powerful party figures who are usually so cautious with their criticism. Gavin Newsom, for example, is quoted directly. He called the outcome an unmitigated disaster.
Unmitigated disaster. Just think about the weight of that language.
It suggests the failure was total. There was no way to recover, no way to spin it.
And Bernie Sanders, a figure who, rarely aligns with the establishment but is a fierce opponent of the president, he reportedly labeled the whole thing a political fiasco.
And when you have your progressive flank and your rising establishment stars agreeing on how bad the failure was,
That signals a total breakdown of confidence.
it's a fundamental systemic failure. The unity of that criticism, bridging both the establishment and the progressives, is so significant. And beyond that, the analysis points to liberal think tanks just panicking behind closed doors.
Because they recognize what happened.
They recognize that the leader gambled big and lost everything. Insiders are suggesting that all that euphoria, built on those minor local election wins, it just evaporated instantly. It was gone.
Gone. Faced with the cold, hard reality of a national legislative defeat.
They walked into what one highly critical analyst called a buzzsaw.
So if the shutdown strategy failed to damage the president, it certainly did one thing. It set the stage for the next, even more explosive development.
The internal party collapse.
A full-scale democratic civil war, which very quickly spilled into public view.
And what's truly remarkable here, based on the notes we have, is that the defeat was delivered not by the other party. It was delivered by the party's own members.
It was an act of political self-sabotage.
Absolutely. It just stripped the leadership of all authority.
So let's detail that breaking point because it is just staggering. Late, one Sunday night, 8 Senate Democrats broke ranks, 8 of their own.
They voted with Republicans to end the shutdown.
This wasn't some slow, negotiated compromise, was it?
Not at all. Within the party, this was immediately seen as a mutiny. That's the word they used. It was an act of open defiance. The analysis describes it as a neon sign flashing no confidence in the leader's ability to, calculate political risk.
To deliver on a strategy.
Right. It wasn't a compromise. It was a surrender. And it was dictated by the rank and file, who decided that the leader's strategy was more damaging to their own careers than just siding with the opposition.
And the internal reaction, particularly in Washington, was just volcanic. We see reports that progressive activists immediately started calling the defectors traitors.
While the leader's own establishment allies were accusing him of having completely lost control, the failure was so public that, in the words of one source, it looked like a political execution on live TV.
It raises a critical question that, you need to understand. Why 8 senators? Who were they?
The analysis indicates they were largely moderate Democrats, from swing states or from states where the president remains extremely popular.
So their decision was purely about political survival.
100%. The sources suggest that they were just not willing to go back and face their constituents, having been blamed for shutting down the government on this flawed strategy.
Especially when it was clear there were no policy gains coming.
They saw the writing on the wall. They could continue fighting for a doomed cause, or they could save their own careers. They chose their careers, and in doing so, they dealt a fatal blow to their own leadership.
And this really speaks to the intense pressure, the perceived recklessness of the whole strategy. The leader found himself caught between 2, as the analysis calls them, angry mobs.
And he was ultimately just crushed by that tension.
Let's clearly define that core tension because it explains this whole leadership crisis. On one side, you had the moderates.
Right. Those 8 senators, being the most prominent among them, they viewed the shutdown strategy as just too reckless.
They were worried about the electoral consequences, alienating swing voters.
It's actually those working-class demographics they desperately need to hold on to.
And on the other side?
On the other side were the radicals. Figures like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and the Squad. They saw the leader as too weak.
So they weren't angry that the government shut down?
No, they were furious that he didn't hold out longer, that he didn't fight hard enough for their maximalist progressive demands. He was in an impossible position.
Fight hard and lose the moderates, or compromise and get targeted by the progressive.
It's a no-win scenario.
And the analysis suggests that a lot of his decision-making during this whole period was driven by this intense, almost paralyzing fear of the radical wing, specifically of AOC. Why does one junior representative hold so much perceived power over a long-term Senate leader?
This is where we connect the infighting to why this matters to you, the listener. The analysis cites polling out of New York, and it suggests that Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez would crush Schumer in a 2028 primary by double digits.
Wow.
So this is not just theoretical. The ability of the progressive movement to fund and mobilize these successful primary challenges against incumbents, that's their primary weapon.
So a senior leader facing the prospect of being ousted by a far-left primary challenger is forced to adopt these increasingly aggressive, often politically unviable national positions.
Just to appease a local activist base. It's that simple.
So In essence, the sources are suggesting he initiated the shutdown not to defeat the president, but to politically save himself from a potential primary challenge years down the line. That's a stunning insight into D.C. priorities.
It is. His attempt to survive AOC's shadow, as they call it, by acting tough on the president, that was fundamentally an act of self-preservation.
And it backfired spectacularly. It triggered an open rebellion.
The source material calls this political cannibalism. It's the party consuming itself because of internal ideological warfare. And you have to remember the context that branded him earlier this year.
Right, the protests.
Progressive groups literally protested outside his home in Brooklyn. They called him a traitor. They threatened a primary if he compromised with Republicans again.
And that moment, the analysis suggests, that defined his panicked move during the shutdown. He saw it as this desperate, visible way to prove his loyalty to the radicals.
Exactly. But in doing so, he alienated his moderates, he damaged the electoral prospects of every Democrat in the chamber, and he ultimately handed his enemies, both internal and external, the weapon to destroy him.
He tried to outmaneuver the populist momentum, and he just lost.
The consequence for you, listening, is that this infighting forces the entire party to adopt positions that may be completely out of step with what's required to win nationally. It just demonstrates how internal political survival often trumps a national governing strategy.
So as the Democratic Party was consumed by mutiny and leadership crises and political cannibalism, the president chose that exact moment to pivot the national conversation.
Completely.
Which brings us to the strategic ambush. The announcement of the $2,000 tariff dividend.
The timing, as political observers noted, was just. It was impeccable. The announcement was made just as the dust was settling from the Schumer disaster. It essentially detonated a political nuke.
And it rendered the entire shutdown discussion irrelevant within hours.
It shifted the frame immediately. The conversation was over.
So let's detail the mechanism of this policy, because the analysis presents it as a fundamentally different approach to economic relief. It's not a traditional stimulus program.
No, it's not. This $2,000 tariff dividend plan is designed as a direct payment to working-class Americans.
And this is where we need to dive into the nuance, because the political brilliance is in how it's funded.
That's the key. The core assertion is that the plan is funded entirely by tariff revenue, money collected from foreign nations. The president, according to the announcement, simply utilized existing, previously collected funds generated from tariffs on imported goods.
And the process details they rolled out were just as important to the political message. The policy was explicitly stated as having no new taxes, no endless bureaucracy, no begging Congress for permission.
That framing just bypasses all the traditional political gridlock that the public, especially the working class, finds so frustrating. By using tariff revenue, the president could position this payment not as government spending or debt,
but as a direct reimbursement.
A cash-back reward for Americans, paid for by foreign trade entities. It's a powerful message.
And the sources are calling this a strategic ambush that flipped the national conversation instantly from the Democrats' shutdown chaos to the tangible benefit of economic relief.
The political instinct was profound. I mean, while Democrats were fighting over who sold out whom, the president was speaking straight to the people. He's offering cash back from tariffs imposed on countries that, in his rhetoric, have been bleeding us dry for decades. This announcement hit Washington like an earthquake because it was simple, it was direct, and it provided a visible, tangible benefit that didn't rely on Congress.
And the public and party response just affirmed its political power almost immediately. Republicans rallied right behind the plan.
Unified their front, yeah.
Independents reportedly loved it, but the most damaging response, politically, came from the grassroots Democratic base itself.
And that's the key takeaway in the analysis. Even Democratic voters were reportedly asking the critical question, why didn't our side think of that?
And that single sentiment just undermines the entire Democratic economic platform. Their narrative, which often focuses on these highly complex social programs or huge spending bills.
Right. This tariff dividend was framed as simple, direct, immediate relief. And it contrasted so sharply with the opposition's perceived focus on identity games and backroom blame.
So let's spend a little more time on this idea that the president redefined the term stimulus. Because when we think of stimulus, we usually think of quantitative easing, deficit spending, tax rebates.
Right. Historically, stimulus relies on debt or inflation. This policy, according to its proponents, is distinct because it doesn't print money. It recirculates money that's already been collected by the Treasury.
From external sources, from tariffs.
Exactly. It ties the concept of economic stimulus directly to trade leverage and a nationalistic policy. The president is asserting that America's power on the global stage, specifically its ability to impose tariffs, should translate into a tangible, direct reward for American workers.
That is a potent political message. Regardless of its long-term economic efficacy, it clearly resonates.
It absolutely does, with the working class voters who often feel detached from the benefits of international trade. And when you combine that bold, simple economic proposal with the internal political chaos of the opposition, it's clear why the sources claim the president instantly owns the headlines, the crowd energy, and the momentum.
He reframed the entire economic debate away from traditional partisan lines.
And into a clear contrast. The party fighting over infighting versus the leader putting cash in your pocket paid for by foreign countries.
The reverberations of this political nuke immediately hit the media landscape, which had spent weeks, crafting a very specific narrative about the shutdown.
Which brings us to the media meltdown and this unexpected shift in accountability.
The problem for the liberal media was, well, genuinely existential. They had invested significant time and resources building up the Democratic leader as the voice of reason.
The responsible adult during the shutdown standoff.
Right. And when the president announced the $2,000 check, their whole script just instantly went up in smoke.
Yeah.
The conversation shifted entirely to economic populism, and it made their previous coverage look dramatically out of touch.
The specific fallout within network panels sounds highly illustrative of the confusion. The sources describe these gatherings turning into therapy sessions for the heartbroken left. They were struggling to process both the political failure and the strategic counterstrike.
You saw key political observers, people who were generally sympathetic to the Democratic cause, acknowledging how severe it was. Larry Sabato, for instance, is cited as admitting that Democrats just misread the room.
The frustration was palpable because they couldn't just spin it away. They wouldn't ignore a policy that promised tangible cash to working families. The attempt by, late-night hosts and media commentators to pivot away from it just fell flat.
Because the political reality was too stark.
One side was delivering cash, the other was delivering chaos.
And this failure was so comprehensive that even longtime allies of the Democratic establishment started turning their criticism inward, which signals a crack in that traditional political echo chamber.
That is the core takeaway from the section. The analysis suggests the powerful media machine that historically protected the Democrats started turning its knives inward. And this is not common. We have specific examples cited that demonstrate how severe this institutional break was.
Give us some of those specific examples of the media self-criticism.
Okay, so we saw The Daily Show's Jon Stewart, a figure who the source claims has carried the water for Democrats for decades, publicly call the surrender a world-class collapse.
World-class collapse.
When someone who operates primarily within that sympathetic media ecosystem uses language that strong, it indicates the sheer scale of the failure was just undeniable, even to those who typically defend the party line.
Let's pause on that point. What does it signal about the Democratic ecosystem when even their most traditional media allies feel compelled to use language like that?
It signals a fundamental loss of confidence in leadership, in strategy. It suggests the failure was so acute that the usual playbook, circle the wagons, blame the opposition, it was impossible to execute credibly.
And the analysis noted that CNN panels sounded like therapy sessions.
And MSNBC hosts were publicly asking this existential question: who's in charge of this party anymore? This level of self-interrogation within friendly media is highly unusual and deeply damaging to the party's stability.
Liberal columnists who had previously defended the party through major scandals were reportedly demanding the leader resign.
Acknowledging the political capital was just irrevocably lost.
So the source material concludes that this event was, quote, too big to spin, too public to hide, and too humiliating to deny.
For the first time in a long time, the truth of a major political failure slipped through their protective filter, and the consequences for the establishment were devastating.
This is the critical mechanism of accountability at play. When the media's capacity to manage the narrative breaks down, which it did here because the policy contrast was so sharp and the internal chaos so visible, the institutional failure becomes universally recognized.
Right, and the leader's attempt to save his career didn't just hurt him, it exposed the party's deepest internal fractures to the entire country. And the media had no choice but to report the visible truth of the implosion.
And unfortunately for the Democratic establishment, the internal rebellion didn't stop with the Senate leader's fate. The source posits that the collapse of the shutdown strategy was just the first domino.
Now we're watching this political wildfire spread across the entire leadership structure.
This is the crucial moment where a tactical failure translates into a systemic institutional threat.
The fear of the radical progressive base, which drove the leader's poor decision, is no longer confined to one senator's office. It's a nationwide phenomenon threatening every moderate and establishment leader.
And we have concrete examples of this revolt already taking root. Insiders suggest a radical New York City councilman has announced a primary challenge against House Minority Leader Hakeem Jeffries.
That shows the immediate, aggressive, tactical response from the far left wing. They see the leadership as weakened and vulnerable, and they're moving immediately to capitalize on that instability.
To reshape the party's power structure.
The message is clear. The establishment cannot protect you, and if you compromise, you will be challenged.
And it's not just in the House. New York Governor Kathy Hochul is reportedly being undermined by her own lieutenant governor. That suggests instability even at the gubernatorial level.
It's a vertical threat, not just a horizontal one. It indicates a broader lack of loyalty and discipline, and the analysis points to the funding mechanism for this revolt. Activist David Hogg is allegedly pouring millions into primary campaigns.
Targeting moderate Democrats who won't bow to the far-left agenda.
So this isn't just organic anger. This is an organized, well-funded effort to enforce ideological purity through electoral challenges nationwide.
This is framed by the sources as a full-scale revolt spreading across Democratic leadership. So if we connect this to the bigger picture, what is the core threat facing every establishment Democrat now? And why should you, listening at home, care about these internal primary battles?
The core threat, as defined by the analysis, is this. Betray the radicals and they will destroy you.
It creates an impossible bind for moderate or centrist Democrats.
Totally. To survive a primary challenge, they have to shift left to appease the base. But shifting left alienates the swing voters in the general election districts they need to win nationally.
So the internal tension, the moderates versus the radicals, that destroyed the Senate leader, is now weaponized and aimed at the entire establishment.
It's forcing the party into an electorally unfavorable position. The party, often called the Party of Unity, is now allegedly eating itself alive live on camera.
Right before the highly critical 2026 midterms.
The timing, as you said, could not be worse. As this internal civil war accelerates and consumes the attention of Democratic leadership, the president is doing what the source claims he does best.
Leading from the front and focusing relentlessly on policy aimed at the working class.
The contrast is stark. It's almost jarring. While one side is arguing over ideological purity and leadership power,
The president is executing a slurry of America First proposals that put working families back in focus. The $2,000 tariff dividend was just the opening shot. Let's detail that policy blitz because within days of the shutdown ending, the president unleashed a whole range of new proposals. Beyond the tariff dividend, what specific areas was he targeting?
he was targeting fundamental pillars of American life: health, inflation, and housing. First, on health policy, he announced plans to replace Obamacare subsidies with expanded use of health savings accounts, or HSA.
Okay, we need to unpack that for the listener. What is an HSA, and what's the political significance of replacing a subsidy with it?
Right. An HSA is a tax-advantaged savings account that you use with a high-deductible health insurance plan. The core idea, as it's framed by the sources, is consumer empowerment.
Okay.
Under the proposed system, instead of money flowing from the government directly to insurance companies, which is what happens with Obamacare subsidies, the money would flow directly into the family's HSA.
Which gives the family control over how they spend that money on routine care.
Exactly. And any unused funds roll over, potentially reducing the reliance on third-party insurers and allowing families to build a health savings nest egg.
So the political pitch isn't just about health care. It's about putting financial control back into the hands of the individual. That aligns perfectly with his populist, small government rhetoric.
It does. It attempts to shift the debate from government-provided healthcare to consumer-controlled healthcare, which is a distinct and very resonant message.
Second, the president also called for investigations into perceived corporate abuses. He's specifically targeting big pharma and foreign-owned meatpacking plants.
To stop what he labeled as price gouging, this is a classic, highly effective populist move. It identifies specific corporate enemies, foreign interests, large pharmaceutical companies, and promises to fight for the consumer.
Against perceived exploitation and inflation.
Right. It allows him to simultaneously attack large corporate entities while positioning himself as the unambiguous champion of the working class against rising costs. It appeals to voters across the spectrum who are frustrated by inflation.
And finally, we saw a bold and highly technical proposal aimed at the housing crisis
Opposing 50-year mortgages?
to make home ownership possible for young buyers who are currently crushed by high interest rates. This sounds almost unprecedented.
It is certainly a massive leap. The technical analysis we've seen suggests the idea is aimed squarely at affordability for younger voters, a demographic that's often skeptical of his politics but is deeply struggling economically.
So by stretching the mortgage term to 50 years, the monthly payment drops significantly.
Potentially opening the door to homeownership for millions who are currently priced out of the market.
But what are the potential economic ramifications? The drawbacks that the sources noted about a 50-year loan?
The sources acknowledge it's a controversial idea. While it drastically reduces the monthly entry cost, critics immediately point out that the buyer ends up paying exponentially more in interest over the full term.
And it raises serious questions about intergenerational wealth transfer and market stability.
It does, but from a purely political perspective, the source material focuses on the fact that it's an active, aggressive attempt to solve a visible crisis housing affordability in a tangible, headline-grabbing way.
Contrasting sharply with the opposition's perceived inaction on core economic issues.
The synthesis drawn by the analysis is that this policy blitz redefines patriotism as prosperity. It contrasts the president's focus on paychecks, peace of mind, and a future of ownership with the Democrats' internal focus on identity politics and power struggles.
It's an attempt to reframe the entire political battlefield around tangible economic gains for the average American.
Yes. The underlying concept is linking national strength tariffs, leverage, domestic industry directly to immediate, observable economic benefits for the citizens. And when the political debate shifts from ideological purity to practical prosperity, the sources suggest that the opposition struggles desperately to compete.
Because they're too focused inward.
Exactly.
This brings us to the concluding analysis of this really pivotal week. The source material is very clear about the immediate fallout for the leader at the center of the storm.
The assessment drawn by political analysts is blunt. The leader's career is effectively over. And this is not hyperbole, according to the sources. It's a calculation based on 3 crippling factors.
Okay, what are they?
His own senators betrayed him in a public mutiny. His base, particularly the radical progressive flank, despises him for failing to fight hard enough. And perhaps most critically, donors are reportedly moving on.
They're looking for the next political figure, seeing him as incapable of leading the party to victory.
That's it.
The shutdown exposed much more than just a tactical legislative failure, according to this analysis. It revealed a moral one, a fundamental weakness in the Democratic Party structure itself.
And that failure is defined by a lack of 3 critical elements: vision, unity, and a leader strong enough to stand against the America First movement.
The sources argue that without a unified, compelling economic vision that resonates with the working class,
And without the internal strength to maintain cohesion under pressure, the party is just rendered incapable of effectively opposing the current administration's populist momentum. Their strategy was flawed, their execution was chaotic, and the consequences are now structural.
meanwhile, the sources claim the opposing side is capitalizing fully on this chaos. The president's approval rating is reportedly surging.
And the $2,000 dividend plan has blue-collar America fired up again. This reinforces that power shift we discussed earlier.
The president is building trust, not with the political elites or the traditional media complex, but with everyday people who feel forgotten.
And the contrast is devastating for the Democrats. As they spiral further and further into chaos fighting these public internal battles over leadership, the president stands on the side of the American worker. It reinforces a consistent message of stability and economic benefit.
The analysis concludes that this wasn't just a government shutdown. It was, in the words of some observers, the shutdown of the Democratic Party itself.
If we connect this back to the long-term implications, the failure of the shutdown, the public mutiny, and the strategic counterstrike by the president represent more than just a bad week. And this leads us to the final provocative thought for you, our listener.
The essential question is whether these events signal a temporary political setback, a crisis that a savvy political party can recover from with time.
Or if this is the long-term structural breakdown of a major American party.
The analysis suggests this may be a structural problem because the internal forces, the radicals versus the moderates, are just irreconcilable. If a leader's failure was due to the impossible pressure from his own base, how can any future leader stabilize the party without suffering the same fate?
That is the ultimate structural quandary. The moderate wing needs to win swing districts, which requires moving toward the center on fiscal and cultural issues. The progressive wing demands ideological purity and threatens primary challenges if they compromise. The shutdown exposed that the progressive wing holds the primary threat weapon, forcing the entire party apparatus left, even at the cost of national electoral viability.
So if that tension remains,
If that tension remains, the 2026 midterms might already be an outcome written in the ashes of this week's legislative failure. The sources suggest the party is now permanently defined by its internal fracturing, not by its policy agenda.
a complex story indeed. Thank you for your deep insights into this political implosion.
Thank you. And thank you to our listeners for joining us for this deep dive.
That's all for this episode of News Focus Podcast. We'll see you next time.